The Intel Core i7-14700K is a very high-end x86-64 based system on chip that released back in October of 2023. With its interesting and rather beefy heterogeneous design, paired with its high power draw, how does this chip hold up in 2025? To cut to the chase, it performs really well, and might even be more appealing than the Core Ultra 7265K, but there are still some oddities worth discussing. To test the 14700K, let's utilize my personal system, a Z690 DDR4 based machine sporting an RTX 4070. While yes, DDR5 performs better, it'll usually manifest as the 1% lows taking a hit, and most of the time the fast 3600 megatransfer per second CL16 DDR4 that we've got paired with this chip is perfectly fine, and might improve gaming performance in some scenarios because of its improved latency over more expensive DDR5 kits. DDR4 ultimately falls behind in total bandwidth, which can improve performance a lot when the cores are accessing large datasets, but this typically helps more in scientific and production workloads instead of gaming. It'll be fine in a lot of scenarios if you're running real-time interactive 3D applications. We've got two Gen 4 NVMe SSDs feeding the system, those being the Western Digital Black SN770 and Timetech Gen 4 premium drives. Full system specs are in the description should you wish to replicate anything you're seeing in this video, but by and large, it's a relatively decent value platform paired with a higher end CPU and GPU, and a more cost-optimized peripheral and memory setup. With the specs out of the way, let's dive into the performance and see if the 14700K is worth considering in mid-2025. Starting off with the typical initial ProSuTech benchmark, Apex Legends. And while this DirectX 12 based game is kind of lightweight for a CPU benchmark, it represents a good starting point for a modern esports centered focus on the chip. While this is only at 1080p in competitive settings, the system was able to draw an average of 255 frames per second, with the 1% low coming in at a still great 163. I'm suspecting I still need to tweak some frame rate options in the config file, because the max of 300 is achieved no matter what modern chip I use, leading me to believe that I'm not fully unlocking the frame rate. But considering the average, it's more than playable on a high refresh rate screen, and would pair nicely with a more powerful GPU than the 4070 we're testing with. I do enjoy playing this game occasionally on this setup, and there's literally nothing to complain about when it comes to frame pacing and the overall performance trends. Black Ops 6, another DirectX 12 based title, saw pretty similar performance to Apex Legends at the basic preset and with DLSS set to the performance setting. I would say that this game is a little heavier weight, considering we're not rendering internally at a native 1080p, but the average of 259 is beyond playable on almost every high refresh rate setup, and the 1% low of 133 shows that performance never really dips down anywhere close to where I would consider it unplayable. Don't get me wrong, the game does look kind of questionable on this preset, but I'd say that that's mostly due to the power level of the 4070, which says more about how heavy this game's renderer is as opposed to any sort of weakness on the GPU. You would probably get a couple more frames with a more powerful GPU, but I'd comfortably say that the 14700K is not the bottleneck here. I decided to test Warzone next to get an idea as to how a game on a similar engine with a much different rendering workload performs. After retesting both Black Ops 6 and Warzone at least 3 times, I found that Warzone, on average, cut frame rates by almost a half on average at the same graphics preset and with DLSS set to performance, coming in at 145 FPS. The 1% lows also took a hit, but the performance hit isn't really as drastic as the average, coming in at 95 FPS. Realistically, there's another preset below basic that could improve performance if you really wanted some extra frames, but as I see it, I don't really have a problem with how things are performing considering this is a large map with a lot more going on that the CPU has to contend with. I'd also like to note that we are definitely CPU limited in this game, because the 4070 was hanging at around 60% usage at 2 GHz, with 2 CPU P cores being stuck at 93% plus usage. This is one of those games where the more expensive DDR5 memory and a Ryzen X3D part would help tremendously, but if you've got a 14700K in your system with DDR4, it's pretty hard to complain about considering it's outputting high refresh rate performance figures. Up next is Counter-Strike 2, a DirectX 11 based competitive first-person shooter developed on the Source 2 engine. I will note that this is a game where I ended up turning the E-cores off because it was messing with the frame rates being achieved during testing. At the low preset with FSR set to balanced, the game achieved an average of 290 FPS with the 1% low coming in at 103. The maximum of 436 shows that the chip has the ability to push incredibly high frame rates, but most of the time sticks around the 300 FPS mark. This game is very playable, but the slightly heavier DX11 renderer makes me curious as to how this same chip would perform on the older DX9 based CSGO. Overall, the performance achieved when stressing the 14700K is pretty impressive, and it's hard to call it anything other than incredibly smooth with some minor drops here and there when you don't have control of the camera. Cyberpunk 2077, an older-ish game also built on DirectX 12, is incredibly heavy on all the components in the system. Even though we're running at the low preset with DLSS set to balanced, the frame rates achieved were so heavily CPU bottlenecked that we could actually probably have raised the settings and resolution and still gotten the same performance. With the 14700K returning an average and 1% low of 90 and 50 FPS respectively, we're not achieving high refresh rate gameplay, but it's also hard to call this anything other than just playable. I suspected that the E-cores were affecting performance, and after retesting, the results were actually worse on average and pretty similar on the 1% lows, leading me to think that this game relies both on strong single-threaded performance and also having lots of cores available to parallelize calculations on. Would I pick up a 14700K just to play Cyberpunk? Probably not, but if this is just one of the games you play out of several, then it's definitely not bad, but it's surpassed by similarly priced chips from AMD. The next game is an Unreal Engine 5 based title, and for all intents and purposes it runs well and looks great. Fortnite at the low preset and with DLSS set to balance performs very well on average, coming in at 226, but the 1% low of 79 looks kind of out of place from what I experienced in game. I suspect this occurred during the drop-in sequence of the match, because once I was on the ground and shooting I never noticed any major dips below 100 FPS. But the fact that it happened is still important to disclose when talking about the performance over the course of a match. Realistically, on a system that's this powerful, you could probably raise some of the graphics and still have an awesome experience on it, but looking at how performance doesn't really scale at resolutions lower than 1080p, it seems like we're more CPU bottlenecked when looking at things from a high level. Fortnite is still a great experience on this chip, but the 7800 and 9800 X3Ds would perform better in some situations and probably pretty similarly in others. But overall the performance from the 14700K is hard to complain about in this title. The next game, Helldivers 2, is also built on DirectX 12 and is much heavier on both the CPU and GPU. At the low preset and with balanced upscaling at 1080p, the 14700K returned a very playable average of 111, with the 1% low of 66 that definitely is noticeable but remains beyond playable. This is one of those games where we're definitely more limited by the GPU rather than the CPU, but even so, I think that a more modern X3D chip from AMD would provide slightly higher 1% lows. Helldivers is a game that is heavy on all systems at all resolutions, but the 14700K provides a very strong base for the GPU in the system to work from. Would I pick up a 14700K just to play Helldivers 2? Probably not. An i5-12400 would be cheaper and provide most of the performance, given games don't really scale with the number of E-cores available, they only really run on the P-cores. So while the 14700K performs well in this game, it's probably not the best value chip even from Intel. Marvel Rivals, aka Jeff the Landshark Simulator, is an Unreal Engine 5 title that runs well on most systems but is definitely heavier than the similar Overwatch. This game performs well when stressing the CPU by utilizing the low graphics preset, DLSS on the performance setting, and limiting the resolution to 1080p. With a 1% low of 78 and an average of 166, it's pretty hard to complain about the performance on display from the 14700K, but it's ultimately beaten by even the 7800 X3D. During testing, the GPU is hanging around at about 50% usage, hinting at a large CPU bottleneck preventing the GPU from rendering more frames. But if you're wanting to get the absolute most amount of frames from your system, then 8-core AMD alternatives would provide better performance when running Marvel Rivals. But keep in mind you're losing 12 additional threads that can be used in any other workload. For gaming, maybe the i7 we've got here isn't really the star of this show, considering the previously mentioned i5-12400 provides very similar performance at less than half the price. But if you're going to use the 14700K to game, the performance you can expect is relatively consistent and high refresh rate capable despite the 1% lows. Minecraft Java Edition version 1.21.4 performs well on average, but the 1% lows come in below where I'd expect, considering where the rest of the performance figures lie. With the average of 318 FPS, you're ultimately getting a very high refresh rate experience in general on this chip, and when the graphical nature of the game is taken into account, it makes sense why you're getting so many frames. But despite the newer threaded setting available in the menu, the 1% lows come in at 40 frames per second, which is most noticeable in hitching when a large number of chunks load in. We're testing at 32 chunk render distance and 16 chunk simulation distances, meaning we've got some headroom to tighten up the average performance, but no matter what I changed, the 1% low never really improved past 50 FPS, showing some fundamental limitation with how Minecraft handles its world rendering. Minecraft Java Edition is a great experience, and once you settle into a specific area of the world, the frame rate drops start to become less frequent. But if you're flying around the world, it's going to be a lot more consistent of an issue no matter what chip you choose to power your machine. I think there are two camps of people primarily looking at the 14700K and who I hope to address with this video, both of which are probably not gaming focused. I don't think diehard gamers think the CPU is all that interesting, because the 9800X3D exists and outperforms the 14700K at a lower power target. And you can also get a full 8 P-cores with the cheaper and still widely available 12700K. That's not to say that this chip can't play games, it most definitely can play them very well. I think it's just worth pointing out popular alternatives to this part if you're looking to just play games on your computer. So if gamers aren't super interested in this chip, who do I think are? Primarily professionals who aren't running mission-critical apps 24/7, so things like photo or video editing, or even working in Blender or Unreal. What the 14700K has going for it over an 8-core part from AMD are 12 E-cores, which really help in productivity applications that just require threads. Video editing applications, I'm thinking of Premiere Pro and DaVinci Resolve, were programs that saw massive performance improvements on older 16-core Ryzen parts. And with the introduction of higher core count heterogeneous parts from Intel, you can pretty easily parallelize across up to 28 threads, though like most things in life there is some give and some take. It's generally accepted that, as a rule of thumb with processing elements, the more cores the better. And while that holds true to an extent, what also matters is the capabilities and overall performance profile of the individual threads and/or cores. For example, a technically octa-core FX 8300 should be superior to an i5-9600K using only the mantra of more cores equals better. But if you know how these chips work under the hood, you probably understand how preposterous I sound by even comparing these two processors. They're just in completely different leagues. Intel also muddied the water by introducing a heterogeneous architecture into the x86 market, meaning that you can't just rely on a core and thread count to determine where the rough performance of a processor will fall. A more modern example of this is comparing the chip I've got here, the 14700K, to something like a Ryzen 9 9950X, and saying that it performs better because it's got more physical cores. In some scenarios that can parallelize, this may be true, and ultimately give the i7 an edge, but in most other similar workloads, the Ryzen 9 part will come out significantly ahead because the cores it does have can get so much more done on an individual basis, despite the i7 having 4 more cores. Mixing cores of differing capabilities has been a fundamental design philosophy in many efficiency-focused multi-core processors over the past close to 30 years now. Usually when a chip needs to be responsive to a sudden touchscreen prompt, a performance core or two is used to handle the immediate interrupts and get a response quickly generated, while less time-sensitive processes are mapped onto several additional low-power cores. This works great for mobile, but desktops ultimately have a different need that a heterogeneous design also solves quite neatly. This is drastically increasing the number of threads per unit of die area. Looking at a die shot of an older i7-12700K, you can see that, without bringing in exact measurements, 4 of these efficiency cores fit into roughly the same footprint as one of the performance cores. The size of these cores is pretty similar on both the 12700 and 14700K, since Raptor Lake is only a slight revision of Alder Lake at the hardware level. But what this ultimately means is you can get 4 total threads from the space you typically get 2. For some processes, like gaming, the performance of your individual threads matter more than having a bunch of them available, while other threads like video or photo editing can just parallelize computations across all the threads despite them not necessarily being super performant. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would say that Intel isn't super far off by comparing Gracemont cores to Skylake threads in terms of what they're able to do in terms of operations per second, but latency-wise, Skylake destroys Gracemont. Probably because the 4 Gracemont cores are sharing a stop on the internal ring bus. However, once data is in the caches, the chips can maintain throughput on a similar level to Skylake chips at comparable clocks. Modern Windows and Linux versions are smart enough to work with the processor to map processes onto the appropriate core type, and by and large they do a great job by default, but there are some edge cases. Some games will map themselves onto the E-cores, and the official Intel-approved way to fix this is to use a BIOS-enabled macro to disable the extra cores temporarily. But I don't really want to have to do this because what if I'm running a background program like OBS? I mean, the games that do this are still hitting over 100 FPS, so there's not really that much to complain about. But if I've got MSI Afterburner open, I can see the P cores being held back by the maxed out E core or 2 that the game is using. From a lower level, the P and E cores are built very differently and optimized for their respective use cases. The P core is a derivative Alder Lake design, technically a refresh of the already derivative Raptor Lake, with enhanced L2 cache structures and optimizations made on the lithographic node. Each P core sports 80 kilobytes of total level 1 cache, split into 36 kilobytes of instruction and 48 kilobytes of data cache. It also has 2 megabytes of private L2 cache, a 768 kilobyte improvement over Alder Lake, but the per core level 3 cache configuration hasn't changed, with 3 megabytes per P core and quad core E core cluster. The only reason this chip has more L3 cache than a 13700K is because it has an extra E core cluster enabled. While the P cores are designed for the low latency and high throughput, as evidenced by the cache hierarchy, the E core is instead optimized for throughput at the cost of some latency. Keep in mind that the E cores, still being based on Gracemont, actually have a larger total private L1 cache coming in at 96 kilobytes, breaking up into 64 kilobytes of instruction and 32 kilobytes of data cache. However, the L2 cache functions a bit differently to the L2 caches found on the P cores. With Gracemont, the L2 cache is private to a quad-core cluster, meaning that each core in the cluster technically has access to all 4 megabytes of L2. During operation though, you're sharing this 4 megabytes with 3 other cores. This can be both a drawback and an advantage in the design, as cores working on similar chunks of data don't need to copy them between each core, but it creates a more restrictive environment when all the cores are being loaded. Moving on to the clocks this chip hits, and out of the box the P cores come in at a very quick 5.6 GHz when boosting, and up to 4.3 GHz on the 12 E cores. Just doing some basic BIOS tuning, I was able to get the P cores on this chip to consistently hit just 5.7 GHz, with 5.8 being possible at times but not at all sustained. The E cores, with any clock adjustments, caused issues, leaving me to just leave those stock and untouched in terms of voltage and clock adjustments. The P cores are interesting in this chip, primarily because they feature some sort of changed voltage regulation, whether that be a digital voltage regulator or just enhancements on an older design. I say this because stock Alder Lake would max out at around 5.4 GHz on consumer boards, and it would draw a ton of power when stressed. Raptor Lake, by comparison, hits over 200 MHz higher out of the box sustained and does it in a more reasonable power envelope. Speaking of power, you're going to want some serious cooling for this chip, whether it be a beefy tower cooler or a 360mm AIO. Because while the 14700K has a base TDP of 125 watts, the PL2 out of the box is 253 watts, which is over double. Realistically though, will you hit this high power drop? Well, the chip I've got here under intense render workloads would sustain around 200 watts, and when gaming we're talking about hanging well under the 125 watt TDP a majority of the time. But there are situations where it can kick out some serious heat. I've seen this 14700K get up to almost 300 watts, but that's rare and pretty infrequent and definitely not sustained. For everyday usage, this chip is really efficient, but the fact that it has the ability to spread its wings and make your system sound like it's taking off is less of a bug and more of a feature. Connectivity-wise, the chip has the PHYs and ability to run PCIe 5 to the GPU in a by 16 configuration, but NVMe SSDs are limited to Gen 4. For some, this will definitely be a turnoff, But for 95% of general purpose users, this is perfectly fine, as you wouldn't want a Gen 5 SSD, either because of the price or the power draw. Your motherboard will determine the number of physical slots available, but most higher end motherboards will feature at least 3 NVMe capable headers, with 4 or more becoming pretty common on mid-range boards as well. USB connectivity is going to depend on your specific motherboard as well, but most Z690 and 790 boards that I've seen have plenty of high-speed Gen 3 USB Type-A, and there's usually 1 or 2 Type-C on the back panel, with connectors for front panel USB-C as well. In general, the 14700K has plenty of fast I/O that you can make use of, and it's definitely not an aspect of this chip that I have any problems with. Along with plenty of high-speed peripherals, the chip supports both DDR4 3200 and DDR5 5600, with your motherboard ultimately deciding which memory type your system supports. DDR5 is probably the de facto first choice for new systems, and in 2025, if you're gonna want to build around the 14700K, DDR5 is probably what I'd recommend if you aren't trying to save money and reuse existing hardware. But in the event that you are, the added support for the cheaper memory standard is a lifesaver, and you don't lose tons of performance by going with it either. As for what it costs to purchase this chip new, you can find it on sites like Amazon and Newegg for at or around $330, which is still expensive but is $100 less than where it stood at almost a year ago. Buying this chip used, you're not really saving that much money considering it's still kind of new, and it's probably a more attractive option than the Ultra 7265K for a lot of users. This all makes for a processor that can fill a couple niches quite compellingly, but falls behind in others. In strictly gaming-focused workloads, which is what this channel typically focuses on, it's outclassed by similarly priced 8-core X3D chips on the AM5 platform if you simply want the highest FPS. Alternatively, if you want to do more productivity-focused tasks such as video or photo editing, offline 3D rendering, animation work, or even game development on Unreal Engine, then the raw computational throughput on offer thanks to its 12 E-cores can help save you time and/or iterate on your work more quickly. This leaves Intel in a weird role reversal from where it stood almost 5 years ago, where instead of being the gaming champ, it's now become the productivity CPU choice if you're wanting more processing power in the higher price ranges. I think that for someone like me, who now uses their computer for more programming and video editing than I do gaming, this is great, but also leaves me the room to still perform very well in games when I do want to load something up.